Picture this. It is the summer of 1945. The war in Europe is winding down. Americans are celebrating in the streets of New York, London, Paris. Church bells are ringing. Mothers are crying tears of relief. Soldiers are kissing strangers. And somewhere over the remote, burning wilderness of Oregon, over fire-swallowed ridgelines and smoke-choked canyons that most Americans will never see in their lifetimes, a young man named Malvin Whitfield is falling through the sky. He is 20 years old. He is extraordinarily fit. He has been trained to the absolute peak of human physical capability. He has qualified as a military paratrooper, which in 1945 means he has endured one of the most brutal selection processes the United States Army could devise. He has jumped from aircraft. He has learned to land. He has learned to pack his own parachute, because if you pack it wrong, you die. Simple as that. Malvin Whitfield is one of the finest soldiers in the United States Army. Malvin Whitfield is black. And as he falls through the smoke-stained Oregon sky, not toward the beaches of Normandy, not toward the fields of the Netherlands, not toward any of the glorious combat theaters where white paratroopers are earning their medals of honor and their Purple Hearts and their place in the history books, but toward a burning forest fire set by a Japanese balloon bomb, Malvin Whitfield already understands something that will take the rest of America decades to acknowledge. He and his brothers fought 2 wars simultaneously, one against an enemy they never got to face in combat, one against a country that drafted them, trained them, or pushed them past every human limit, and then told them, with a straight face and a government stamp, that they weren't good enough to fight. This is the story of the 555th Parachute Infantry Battalion, the Triple Nickles, America's first black paratroopers. And this is a story you were never supposed to know. Before we go any further, drop a comment right now. Tell me, what country are you watching from? I want to know where in the world this story is reaching. Whether you're in Lagos or London, Kingston or Karachi, Atlanta or Auckland, drop your location below. Because this story belongs to the whole world, and I want to know who's here for it. And if this is your first time on this channel, hit that subscribe button, hit the like button. Because we are dedicated to telling the real history. And the history that got cut out of textbooks, the history that got buried in archives, the history that the people who lived it deserve to have told, and that you deserve to hear. New videos every week. Don't miss them. Now. Let's go back to where this story really begins. To understand the Triple Nickles, you need to understand America in 1941. Not the America of mythology, not the America of the Norman Rockwell paintings with the turkey on the Thanksgiving table and the wholesome family gathered round. Not the America that gets celebrated in the war movies where everybody's on the same team, everybody's pulling together, everybody's fighting for the same dream. The real America, the America that existed. In 1941, there were states in this country where a black man could be lynched for looking at a white woman the wrong way, and the men who did it would walk free. There were states where black Americans could not vote, could not sit at a lunch counter, could not drink from the same water fountain as white Americans. There were states where the law itself, not the prejudice of individuals, but the law, explicitly created 2 categories of human beings, those with full rights and those without. This was Jim Crow America, legal apartheid, systematic, documented, government-sanctioned inequality. And into this America, in December of 1941, came Pearl Harbor. The bombs fell on a Sunday morning. More than 2,400 Americans died. Battleships sank in the harbor. Planes burned on the runways. And the next day, in cities and towns across the country, young men lined up at recruiting offices to enlist. Black men lined up too. They lined up because America was their country too, even if America sometimes forgot that fact. They lined up because they had sons and brothers and fathers who could be killed in a Japanese attack the same as any white man. They lined up because they believed, many of them, against all evidence, that if they fought for this country, if they bled for this country, if they died for this country, then maybe this country would finally start treating them like the citizens they were. It was a complicated, heartbreaking kind of patriotism, and it was absolutely genuine. The Army had a position on this. The Army's position was, "We'll take you, but you stay over there." The military in 1941 was strictly segregated. Black soldiers served in separate units, commanded by white officers assigned to separate facilities, given separate and uniformly inferior equipment, housing, training grounds, and opportunities. The Army's official position, backed by studies and reports that it commissioned itself, was that black soldiers were inherently less capable, less intelligent, and less reliable than white soldiers. This wasn't fringe racism. This was official United States government policy, written into military doctrine, taught at officer schools, and enforced with the full authority of the chain of command. The Army had a name for this philosophy. They called it the Protective Mobilization Plan. Others called it something simpler, a lie. Because here's what the studies actually showed. When anyone bothered to look honestly at the data, black soldiers who received equivalent training, equivalent equipment, and equivalent leadership performed equivalently to white soldiers, sometimes better. The data was there. It had been there since the Civil War. It had been reinforced by the performance of black units in World War I. But data, apparently, was no match for prejudice, when the prejudice was baked into the institution at every level. So the Army took black men's bodies, took their time, took their labor, and then told them where they could and couldn't go, what they could and couldn't do, and who they were and weren't good enough to become. And then, in the fall of 1943, in a converted barracks at Fort Benning, Georgia, the home of the United States Army's Airborne Command, something happened that changed everything. You have to understand what the paratroopers were in 1943. They weren't just soldiers. They were the soldiers. They were the elite, the apex, the tip of the spear that the entire United States military machine was grinding itself down to produce. Since the Army had established its Airborne Command in 1942, the paratroopers had become something almost mythological, men who leaped from aircraft into combat, who operated behind enemy lines, who were selected from among thousands of volunteers and put through training so brutal that the majority of men who started it never finished. The physical requirements alone were extraordinary. You had to be in peak cardiovascular condition. You had to be strong enough, coordinated enough, and mentally tough enough to exit a moving aircraft at altitude, navigate a parachute descent under potential enemy fire, land without breaking bones, gather your equipment, and immediately begin fighting. The training included daily runs that would break recreational athletes obstacle courses that regularly sent men to the infirmary, hand-to-hand combat drills, weapons qualification, and, of course, the jumps themselves. 5 qualifying jumps culminating in one night jump. Failure at any point meant you washed out. You went back to regular infantry. No shame in that. Except that in the culture the paratroopers had built, there was, frankly, quite a lot of shame in it. These men were intensely proud of what they'd earned. The silver jump wings, the boots, the prestige. And the prestige was real because the casualty rates were real. Paratroopers went in first. Paratroopers went in alone. Paratroopers operated in conditions where support might be days away. The 82nd Airborne, the 101st Airborne. These units would become legends, and many of the men in them would become casualties. The risk was genuine, the courage required was genuine, and the selection process was designed to find the men who could meet it. Black men were not allowed to apply, not discouraged, not warned away with raised eyebrows and polite suggestions, not allowed. The airborne was white, and that was the end of the conversation as far as the United States Army was concerned. Until Private Walter Morris walked into a white officer's office. Walter Morris was a black soldier stationed at Fort Benning in 1943. He had been watching the paratroopers, their training, their jumps, their bearing, and he had made a decision. He was going to become one. And he walked into the office of a white officer named Lieutenant Colonel James Gavin, one of the most respected airborne officers in the Army. And he said something to the effect of, "Sir, I want to jump." Now, Gavin could have dismissed him. Most officers would have. The regulations were clear. The tradition was clear. The entire culture of the institution said, "This is not for you." Gavin didn't dismiss him. Gavin was complex, as many men of that era were complex. He upheld many of the structures he had inherited. He was not a civil rights pioneer by any stretch of the imagination. But he was also a military man who understood something fundamental, the value of soldiers who wanted to be there, who had chosen the hard thing, who had walked through a door that everyone told them was closed. And the conversation between Morris and Gavin, and the conversations that followed, set something in motion. And in August of 1943, in a test platoon that would be watched by the Army with an eye toward either validating or discrediting the potential of black paratroopers, 17 black soldiers reported for airborne training at Fort Benning, Georgia. 17 men. To prove what an entire race of people was capable of. No pressure. Imagine that. The test platoon had 2 purposes, though only one of them was openly stated. The stated purpose was to evaluate whether black soldiers could meet the physical and mental demands of airborne training. The unstated purpose, the one everyone in that barracks could feel in the air, was to find a reason to say no. Because the Army didn't actually want this to work. This wasn't an earnest experiment conducted by open-minded scientists. This was a trial by combat, and the institution that ran the trial had already decided on the verdict. If these 17 men failed, if even a handful of them washed out, if their performance lagged behind white units by even a fraction, the Army would have its data, its cover, its reason to slam the door and bolt it shut. The men in that platoon knew this. Every single one of them knew that he was not just running for himself. He was running for every black man in America who might ever want to wear jump wings. Every additional repetition he knocked out on that obstacle course wasn't just a personal achievement, it was a political act. Every qualifying jump wasn't just a milestone, it was a rebuttal to every report that said he couldn't do it. Oh, they trained with a ferocity that astonished even the white instructors who had come prepared to find fault. The runs. Fort Benning's jump school ran candidates through physical conditioning that was designed to be punishing under any circumstances. The heat of a Georgia summer added another dimension of misery. These men ran in formation every day, distances and paces calculated to separate the serious from the casual. And they ran faster than required. They did more push-ups than required. They pushed each other in the barracks, pushed each other on the track, built a culture within their platoon of absolute refusal to give anyone a reason. One account from a white training officer at Fort Benning noted his surprise at the platoon's performance metrics. He had expected, because he had been trained to expect, mediocrity. What he observed was excellence. All 17 men completed the training. All 17 earned their wings. The Army looked at the results. The Army looked at the data. The Army did not, as you might hope, immediately abandon its prejudices and throw open the doors of the airborne to all qualified soldiers, regardless of race. The Army did what institutions do when confronted with evidence that contradicts their preferred conclusions. It created a segregated black parachute unit. The 555th Parachute Infantry Company, which would eventually expand into a full battalion, was activated on December 30th, 1943. America's first black parachute unit, not integrated into the existing airborne, not given the same assignments as white airborne units, separate, contained, controlled. But here's the thing about a unit of men who have already proven the impossible once. They don't scare easy. The 555th grew. What had started as a company of roughly 100 men expanded as black soldiers from across the Army learned that this unit existed, that there was a place where a black man could earn jump wings, could serve as an airborne soldier, could be part of the elite. The word spread through the segregated sections of military bases, through letters home and conversations in mess halls, and whispered recommendations from men who knew men. If you want to jump, go to the 555th. The men who came were extraordinary. They were extraordinary, not despite the obstacles they faced, but partly because of them. To get to the 555th, you had to first navigate the Army's intake system, which was already designed to steer black soldiers away from prestigious assignments. You had to volunteer for a unit that didn't officially advertise itself. You had to be in elite physical condition. You had to be accepted. And then you had to survive the training. The selection process filtered for exactly the kind of men who were going to make the 555th what it became: ambitious, physically exceptional, intellectually capable, and possessed of a particular psychological fortitude that comes from having fought for everything you have against systems that don't want you to have it. By 1944, the 555th Parachute Infantry Battalion had grown to more than 600 men, 600 black paratroopers, all volunteers, all trained to the same standard as any white airborne soldier in the United States Army. And they were magnificent. Of the training that occurred at Camp Mackall, North Carolina, where the battalion was stationed for much of its formation period, was everything that airborne training was supposed to be, and more. The 555th pushed itself with an intensity that went beyond the requirements because the requirements were never really the point. The point was to be undeniable. To build a unit so obviously, demonstrably excellent that even the most committed skeptic couldn't manufacture a reason to dismiss them. Their physical conditioning was exceptional. Their weapons qualification scores were high. Their discipline was tightly maintained because they understood, bone deep, that a single disciplinary incident could be used to paint the entire battalion. One man's failure was the battalion's failure. The battalion's failure was ammunition for every general who wanted to keep the airborne white. So they held each other accountable with a rigor that went beyond military regulation into something closer to a moral compact. They were building something. All of them could feel it, and they were preparing for war, because by 1944, the war in Europe was reaching its crescendo. D-Day had happened. The Allies were pushing into France, into Belgium, into Holland. The 82nd and 101st Airborne were being used in operations that were generating headlines and heroes and history. Operation Market Garden, the Battle of the Bulge. These were the moments that would define a generation's memory of the war. And the 555th was at Camp Mackall, training, waiting, being told their deployment orders were coming, being told to hold on, being told to be ready. Being told everything except the truth. Here is the truth that the men of the 555th slowly, painfully came to understand as 1944 turned into 1945. They were never going to Europe, not because they weren't ready. They were ready. Every evaluation, every inspection, every performance metric said they were ready, not because there wasn't a need. The Army was burning through manpower in Europe at a rate that had led to the unprecedented decision to retrain artillery units as infantry replacements. There was absolutely a need for trained combat paratroopers. They were not going to Europe because the United States Army could not bring itself to integrate a combat deployment. To send the 555th into combat in Europe would have meant operating alongside white units. It would have meant black soldiers in the same trenches, or eating from the same field kitchens, bleeding in the same mud as white soldiers. And for many of the senior officers making these decisions, that was a more troubling prospect than losing the war. This is the part of the history that's hardest to sit with. Not the overt racism, that's almost easier to process, because at least it's honest about what it is. The hardest part is the bureaucratic, administrative cowardice, the memos, the reports, the meetings where men in uniforms looked at each other across tables and decided, carefully, quietly, with full knowledge of what they were doing, that prejudice was worth more than victory. While the 555 waited, airborne operations in Europe that could have used their skills went on without them. While the 555 trained and trained and trained, the men they had been trained alongside were men of the 82nd and 101st who had gone through the same qualification process, were earning combat experience, combat decorations, and the combat reputation that would follow them for the rest of their lives. The 555th was being robbed, not of money or property, of history, of the experience that defines a soldier's identity, of the opportunity to test themselves against the actual enemy, not just the training ground enemy. They had prepared for war. They had earned the right to fight it. And someone, somewhere up the chain of command, had decided that wasn't going to happen. Then, in the spring of 1945, the orders came, not to Europe, not to the Pacific, not to any of the theaters where American paratroopers were earning their reputations, to Oregon. To understand why the Army sent the 555th to Oregon, you need to know about something that most Americans have never heard of, even today. FUGO, Fusen Bakudan, balloon bombs. Beginning in late 1944, Japan launched a secret weapons program that was, by any measure, one of the most audacious and strange military operations in the history of warfare. Japanese engineers had discovered that there existed, at high altitude over the Pacific Ocean, a consistent high-speed air current, what we now call the jet stream, that flowed from Japan toward the North American continent, and they decided to weaponize it. Japanese workers, many of them schoolgirls and young women pulled from their classrooms to serve the war effort, constructed approximately 9,000 enormous paper and silk balloons, each roughly 33 feet in diameter. These balloons were designed to carry incendiary devices, fire bombs, across the Pacific Ocean, riding the jet stream, to land on the forests and cities of North America. The concept was to set North American forests ablaze, forest fires that would overwhelm civil defense resources, that would destroy the timber that fed the war production machine, that might spread to cities, that would, and this was the explicit psychological goal, terrify the American civilian population into understanding that the Pacific War was not happening on the other side of the world. It was here. It was real. It could reach them. From November 1944 through April 1945, Japan launched thousands of these balloons. Approximately 300 of them made it to North America. They were found in Alaska, in California, in Oregon, in Washington, in Montana, in Wyoming, in Kansas, in Iowa. One was found in Michigan. Several caused forest fires. One killed 6 people in Oregon, a pregnant woman and 5 children who discovered a balloon bomb while on a church picnic. They are the only American civilians killed by enemy action in the continental United States during World War II. The government suppressed all information about the balloon bombs. Absolute press blackout. The fear was that if the Japanese knew how many balloons were reaching their targets, they would launch more. So the American public was told nothing. The Oregon family's deaths were initially censored, but the fires were real and they were dangerous. The Pacific Northwest's vast wilderness, millions of acres of old-growth forest, much of it critically important to the war effort as a source of timber for aircraft production. A shipbuilding and construction was a tinderbox. The forest fire threat was genuine and growing. The Army's firefighting resources were inadequate for the scale of what might be coming. And someone, somewhere in the chain of command, had an idea. The Army had paratroopers. What were paratroopers for? Inserting forces rapidly into inaccessible terrain. And what was a remote wilderness fire if not inaccessible terrain? What if you took trained paratroopers and had them jump into wilderness fires, not to fight an armed enemy, but to fight fire, bringing equipment and training that conventional forest fire crews couldn't? The program was called Operation Firefly, and the unit selected to carry it out was the 555th Parachute Infantry Battalion. For a moment, just a moment, put yourself in the shoes of a man in the 555th when those orders came down. You have volunteered for the most elite assignment in the United States Army. You have run farther and trained harder and pushed yourself past limits you didn't know you had. You have qualified as a military paratrooper. You have spent months preparing for combat, learning to handle weapons, studying tactics, building the physical and mental conditioning that combat requires. You have watched men you trained with ship out to Europe. You have read newspapers about operations in which men like you, paratroopers, airborne soldiers, are making history. You have waited and trained and waited and trained. And now your orders have arrived. You are going to Oregon to fight forest fires, not the German army, not the Japanese imperial forces. Forest fires in a country where your own government considers you a second-class citizen. How do you feel about that? And here's the question that's even harder to answer. What do you do with how you feel? Because the men of the 555th did something remarkable. Something that, when you understand the full weight of what was being done to them, becomes one of the most extraordinary acts of disciplined professionalism in the history of the American military. They went. They went without public complaint. They went without the kind of organized protest that would have been understandable, justifiable, and career-ending in the military culture of 1945. They went because they were soldiers, and soldiers follow orders, and because somewhere beneath the legitimate anger at what was being done to them, there was something more complicated and more admirable than simple compliance. They went because they were going to be excellent at it. Whatever assignment you give us, whatever assignment, we will excel at it. We will make it impossible to say that we weren't good enough. We will take the mission that was designed to sideline us and turn it into proof of everything we've been trying to prove. That was the unspoken compact within the 555th. It was a form of resistance that doesn't get enough credit. The resistance of refusing to be diminished by diminishment, of taking the insult and converting it into achievement. It was exhausting, it was profoundly unfair, and it was magnificent. Operation Firefly began in the summer of 1945. The 555th was based at Pendleton Field in Oregon. Operating under the Forest Service and the Army Air Forces, the mission, on paper, sounded relatively simple. When a fire was spotted in the remote wilderness, a team of smokejumpers would be dispatched by aircraft. They would jump into the area near the fire, carrying equipment. They would contain or extinguish the fire before it could spread. In practice, it was one of the most physically demanding and dangerous assignments in the that can send a man into the canopy of a tree rather than an open landing zone. And there is fire. Fire in a wilderness context behaves in ways that are not intuitive to anyone who hasn't been trained to understand it. It moves with the wind, and the wind in mountain terrain is chaotic and shifts without warning. A fire that appears to be moving away from you can turn in minutes and be advancing toward you faster than you can run. Fire creates its own weather systems, generating updrafts and downdrafts that interact with terrain in complex and deadly ways. Fire consumes oxygen and produces toxins. Fire in dense forest can create a firestorm phenomenon where the entire forest canopy ignites simultaneously and the heat becomes unsurvivable. The men of the 555th jumped into all of this. They made 1,200 individual jumps over the course of Operation Firefly. Let that number land for a moment. 1,200 jumps into burning wilderness, in terrain so remote that some of these fires could only be accessed by air, carrying tools, Pulaski's and McLeod tools and shovels and hand pumps, along with their parachute gear, so they could hit the ground and immediately begin working. They fought 36 fires over the course of the operation, 36 fires in the remote wilderness of Oregon and Washington, any one of which, unchecked, could have consumed thousands of acres of forest, critical to the war effort. They controlled every single one, not one fire that the 555 T8 was dispatched to fight spread beyond their containment. 0. But this is where the story gets physically brutal. Because the jumping itself, the jumping into this terrain, was taking a toll that went beyond what even the Army's robust medical support could fully address. Because the jumps weren't clean. They couldn't be. The landing zones near active fires were not the manicured drop zones at Fort Benning or Camp Mackall. They were narrow clearings at the edges of burning forest, rocky terrain where a hard landing could shatter a leg, tree-studded approaches where men punched through canopy at altitude and swung into branches and hung suspended 40 feet above the ground, unable to reach it on their own. Over the course of Operation Firefly, the 555th suffered an injury rate that was sobering. Men broke bones. Men were burned. Men were injured in landing accidents that fractured legs and twisted knees and wrenched shoulders. At least 2 men were killed during the operation, though accounts vary on the precise casualty figures, partly because the operation was classified and partly because the Army was not particularly diligent about documenting the sacrifices of black soldiers. Private Malvin Brown was severely injured in a tree landing accident. Staff Sergeant Theodore Mosby suffered injuries that required medical evacuation. There were burns, lacerations, internal injuries. Men who had trained for combat were being injured not by enemy fire, but by the collateral physics of jumping into terrain that was, in many cases, barely jumpable by any reasonable standard. And they kept going. New missions would come down. Men who had been injured in the previous jump would look at their injuries, look at their buddies, and make the calculation, can I still jump? Can I still work? And if the answer was anything close to yes, they jumped. This is the part that doesn't make it into the textbooks. Not the heroic jumping in general, but the specific physical cost of what these men absorbed, and the fact that they absorbed it without the recognition, the prestige, or the combat awards that would have accompanied equivalent sacrifice in a combat theater. There were no combat infantryman badges awarded to the men of the 555th. No combat pay, no citations for extraordinary valor under enemy fire, because the enemy was fire, and the Army's decoration system had not been designed to acknowledge this particular form of courage. They bled for a country that would not acknowledge their blood. Between jumps, the men of the 555th existed in a state of double consciousness that would have been psychologically crushing for lesser men. They were stationed in the Pacific Northwest, which, compared to the South, was relatively progressive on racial matters. But relatively progressive in 1945, America still meant segregated barracks, restricted access to base facilities, and the constant low-grade reminder from the surrounding white civilian world that your presence was tolerated rather than welcomed. In Pendleton, Oregon, the men of the 555 TIAF encountered the usual landscape of Jim Crow, restaurants that wouldn't serve them, establishments that turned them away, the persistent background noise of a society that had decided their bodies were available for sacrifice, but their humanity was something to be debated. Some of the men found warmth in the local community. There are accounts of local families who welcomed them, who understood what they were doing and respected them for it. But these moments of grace were islands in a larger sea of indifference and exclusion. And they were getting newspapers. They were reading about the war in Europe. They were reading about the airborne operations. They were reading about the medals being given, the celebrations being planned, the homecoming that was coming. And they were calculating with painful precision exactly how much of that was going to apply to them. Walter Morris, who had been one of the driving forces behind the creation of the 555th, who had walked into that officer's office and started this whole chain of events, looked at what was happening around him and felt what any honest man in his position would have felt. Fury, quiet, controlled, burning fury, not at the fires, not at Japan or Germany or any external enemy, but at the specific cruelty of a system that took everything these men had to offer and then arranged things so that even their offering couldn't be fully acknowledged. Because here's the bitter arithmetic of the situation. The 555th was being praised within the bounds of their assignment. The Forest Service thought they were extraordinary. The officers who supervised Operation Firefly were genuinely impressed by what these men accomplished. There were no complaints about performance, no failures, no incidents that could be used as ammunition by those who had always wanted to say, "See, we told you so." But praise from the Forest Service for fighting wildfires was not the same thing as combat recognition. It didn't open the same doors. It didn't build the same kind of reputation, and everyone knew it. The men in the 555th knew it, the officers who commanded them knew it, and the men making policy decisions in Washington knew it. The 555th had been given an assignment calibrated to keep them excellent and invisible simultaneously. They could be the best smoke jumpers in the program, and they were. And it wouldn't matter to the post-war world the way combat experience would have mattered. This is what systemic injustice looks like when it's operating at full efficiency. It's not always overt brutality. Sometimes it's giving a man every opportunity to prove himself in a context where the proof won't count. The war ended in August of 1945. Japan surrendered following the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The Pacific War was over. The Second World War was over. America erupted into celebration. Times Square, ticker tape parades, church bells across the continent, and the men of the 555th came home. Not to parades, not to the celebrations that awaited white veterans in cities across the country, not to the GI Bill benefits that would, in practice, be far more accessible to white veterans than to black veterans due to administrative practices at the local level that systematically denied black veterans access to loans, education benefits, and job placement services. They came home to the same America they had left, Jim Crow America, a separate water fountains America. We don't serve your kind America. Some of them went back to states where they still couldn't vote. Sergeant First Class Malvin Whitfield, the young man we met falling through the Oregon sky in our opening moments, came home and channeled his extraordinary physical gifts into track and field. He would go on to win 2 gold medals at the 1948 London Olympics and one at the 1952 Helsinki Olympics, becoming one of the greatest middle-distance runners in American history. The same discipline, the same ferocity, the same refusal to be second that he had carried through the 555th. Many of the men of the 555th went on to distinguished careers in the desegregated military that eventually emerged after President Truman's Executive Order 9981 in 1948. That executive order, which mandated the desegregation of the United States Armed Forces, was signed in part because of the pressure exerted by the performance of black soldiers during World War II. The 555th's excellence was part of that argument. Their service helped build the case that made Truman's order politically possible. They changed history without getting credit for changing it. How many stories in American history work exactly like that? Let's talk about what the men of the 555th actually were, not what the Army said they were, not what the history books, when they bothered to mention them at all, described them as, what they actually were when you assess their service honestly and completely. They were trained combat paratroopers who were denied combat. Let that sit. Everything required to fight as a paratrooper they possessed. And the physical conditioning, the weapons training, the tactical knowledge, the parachute qualification, the mental fortitude, everything. And they were given an assignment that utilized their jumping ability while ensuring that the combat expertise they had spent years building would never be tested against an actual enemy. This was not an accident. It was a decision, a deliberate, documented, institutional decision to keep these men in a role where they could be excellent without being threatening, where their excellence wouldn't challenge the fundamental premise of white military supremacy that the Army had built its entire culture around. The psychological toll of this on a group of men who had volunteered, who had trained, who had built their identities around being combat ready, that toll is hard to fully calculate. But you can get a sense of it from the accounts that exist, from the memoirs and oral histories and interviews that came later, when some of the veterans began to speak about what that period felt like from the inside. One veteran, speaking decades later, described the feeling of watching the war end from Oregon, watching the news come in about Japan's surrender, and feeling simultaneously relieved that the killing was over and devastated that it was over before he got to contribute in the way he had prepared to contribute. "We were ready," he said. "We were always ready, and we never got the chance. We were always ready, and we never got the chance." There are sentences that carry a whole history inside them. That's one of them. The story of the 555th did not end with the war. In the post-war years, as the Army slowly, reluctantly, and never quite voluntarily moved toward integration, some of the men of the 555th played direct roles in shaping what came next. The 555th was eventually deactivated, and its personnel were absorbed into the newly integrated 82nd Airborne Division at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, in 1947. This was, in one sense, a victory. Black paratroopers were now serving alongside white paratroopers in the same unit. Integration was happening, but it happened in the shadow of everything that had come before, and the men who had been in the 555th carried with them the knowledge of what had been done to them and the quiet determination that it wouldn't be forgotten. For decades, though, it essentially was forgotten. The Triple Nickles didn't appear in the major histories of World War II airborne operations. They weren't in the popular documentaries. They weren't mentioned in the memorial narratives that constructed the public memory of the war. Operation Firefly was classified for years, and when it was eventually declassified, the significance of what the 555th had done wasn't exactly rushed into the spotlight. The veterans aged, many of them died, and with each death, another direct witness to what had happened was lost. But some of them kept telling the story to their children, their grandchildren, their communities. They kept the history alive in the spaces where Black history has always survived when official history couldn't be bothered, in families, in churches, in the oral traditions of communities that knew their people had done extraordinary things even when the records didn't show it. And slowly, too slowly, and too late for many of the men who deserved to see it, the recognition began to come. In 1993, nearly 50 years after the 555th was activated, the battalion was formally inducted into the U.S. Army Ranger Hall of Fame. This was a significant recognition, acknowledging the pioneering role the Triple Nickles had played not just in the history of Black military service, but in the history of American Special Operations Forces broadly. In 2012, more than 60 years after the fact, the city of Pendleton, Oregon, where the 555th had been stationed during Operation Firefly, held a formal recognition ceremony for the veterans. What had once been a military base where these men lived in segregated barracks was now a site of civic commemoration. The mayor spoke. Local officials honored what the men had done for their community and their country. For the veterans who were still alive to attend, it meant something. Of course it did. Recognition always means something, even when it comes late. Even when the men who should have been there, the friends who didn't survive, the comrades who had died waiting for acknowledgement, weren't there to receive it. But here's the thing about late recognition that's always true. It is simultaneously better than no recognition and profoundly inadequate as a substitute for timely recognition. Honoring a veteran in 2012 for service in 1945 is a good and necessary thing. It is not the same thing as having honored him in 1945. Time lost is not returned by ceremony. Dignity denied is not fully restored by a plaque. The men of the 555th understood this. The ones who were still living understood it, and the families of those who weren't understood it on their behalf. They accepted the recognition with grace, because they were graceful men. But grace is not the same thing as forgetting. The Army, to its credit, has in recent years worked to more formally document the history of the 555th and to ensure that it is represented in the official record of American military history. There are exhibits in military museums, there are educational programs, there are documentaries, including now this one, working to bring this story to audiences who should have learned it decades ago. The 555th Parachute Infantry Battalion Association formed by veterans to keep their history alive and to advocate for recognition, worked for years as a living act of historical preservation. As the veterans aged and passed, the association's work became more urgent, a race against time to document and transmit what they had lived before the living witnesses were all gone. The story is being preserved. That matters. But the story also needs to be told loudly and widely, and with the full weight of what it actually means, not as a footnote, not as an inspirational aside in a broader narrative, but as the central, defining story it deserves to be. So what does this story actually mean? What is the lesson that the 555th Parachute Infantry Battalion is trying to teach us? Across the 7 decades since they jumped into burning Oregon forests on behalf of a country that treated them as less than full citizens? First, excellence is not a guarantee of justice. This is the hardest truth in the 555th story. And it's a truth that Black Americans have been living with for centuries. The men of the 555th were excellent by every measurable standard. They outperformed expectations. They completed their training with distinction. They accomplished every mission they were given, and the system still found a way to deny them the recognition and opportunity they had earned. Excellence matters. It is worth pursuing. It can create openings and shift possibilities and build cases that eventually move policy. The Triple Nickles' excellence contributed to the argument that led to military desegregation. That's real and it's important. But excellence on its own cannot dismantle a system that is invested in inequality. Changing that system requires what the 555TS story also demonstrates: persistence, documentation, organized advocacy, and the willingness to demand justice over decades, if that's what it takes. Second, history is not neutral. The fact that most people watching this documentary, right now, wherever you are, have never heard of the 555th Parachute Infantry Battalion is not an accident. History is constructed. Someone chooses what gets remembered, what gets taught, what gets celebrated, and what gets omitted. And for most of American history, those choices were made by people who had reasons to prefer a version of events that centered white achievement and minimized or erased Black contribution. The Triple Nickles were erased not just from popular memory, but from the military's own official history for decades. They were given a classified mission, and then the classification was used, in effect, to ensure that their service couldn't be publicly acknowledged. Every mechanism of the system worked against their visibility. When you learn this history, you are not just learning about the 555th. You are learning about how history works, about the choices that shape collective memory, and about the responsibility we have to seek out the stories that were suppressed. Third, the two-war framework is still with us. The 555th fought 2 wars, one against the stated enemy of the United States and one against the systemic inequality within the United States. The second war is the one they were never supposed to talk about, the one that would get you labeled a troublemaker, a malcontent, a soldier who couldn't just focus on doing his job. Black Americans in uniform have been fighting this two-war dynamic since the Civil War. The Revolutionary War. Every conflict in American history has been simultaneously a war against an external enemy and a war for recognition, dignity, and equality within American society. And in most of those wars, the external enemy has eventually been defeated or accommodated while the internal struggle continues. The struggle continues. That's not a political statement. It's a historical observation. The specific forms of the struggle have changed. Legal apartheid is gone. The military is desegregated. Black Americans serve at every rank, in every branch, including at the highest levels of military command. That progress is real and it matters. But the dynamic, the experience of being asked to sacrifice for a society that doesn't fully include you, of having your sacrifice questioned or minimized or redirected, that dynamic has not been fully resolved. And the 555th story is one of the clearest possible illustrations of both how that dynamic works and how extraordinary people can be in the face of it. There is an image I want to leave you with. It exists in my mind, assembled from the accounts and photographs and oral histories of the men of the 555th. Maybe you've built a version of it in your mind too over the course of this documentary. It's a summer evening in Oregon, 1945. The Pacific Northwest sky is that particular shade of blue that exists only in that place and time, deep and clear and enormous. There's smoke in the distance. There's always smoke in the distance that summer. The smell of pine and char hangs in the air. And a group of young black men, paratroopers, why all of them, veterans of one of the most unusual and demanding assignments of the entire war, are sitting together outside their barracks. Some of them are writing letters home. Some of them are reading newspapers, following the reports from Europe and the Pacific. Some of them are just sitting, in the way that soldiers sit when they have a moment of quiet, with that particular mix of exhaustion and alertness and awareness of the present moment that comes from spending your days doing dangerous things. They are magnificent. They are 20 years old, 22, 25. They are at the absolute peak of what a human being can be physically. They are trained and disciplined and tested. And they know, all of them know, without it needing to be said, that when this is over, they will go home to a country that is going to try very hard to pretend they weren't here. That is going to try to tell a story about the war in which they don't appear, or appear only as footnotes, or appear as a minor curiosity, rather than as the pioneers they actually are. They know this. And they sit there anyway in the Oregon evening, and they are remarkable. Because what they are choosing in the face of everything they know is to stay, to remain, to continue serving, to refuse in their bearing and their discipline and their excellence to give the system the satisfaction of making them less than they are. That is a kind of courage that doesn't get nearly enough credit. Not just the courage to jump from aircraft, though that is real, and don't let anyone tell you otherwise, but the deeper, harder, more sustained courage to maintain your dignity and your excellence inside a system that is actively working to deny both. The 555th Parachute Infantry Battalion, 600 black paratroopers, 1,200 jumps, 36 fires, 0 failures. They were always ready, and they were excellent. Malvin Whitfield went on to win 3 Olympic gold medals and become one of the greatest middle-distance runners in history. He later served as a sports ambassador for the State Department, representing the country that had held him to second-class citizenship, representing it with the grace and excellence that had defined his entire life. He died in 2015 at the age of 91. He spoke about the 555th in interviews in his later years with a mixture of pride and sorrow that never fully resolved into one or the other, because the story itself never fully resolved. The pride was real, the excellence was real, the brotherhood was real, and the injustice was also real, and it had never been fully acknowledged in the way it deserved. Walter Morris, the man who had started it all by walking into an officer's office and saying, "I want to jump," went on to become an accomplished military career soldier in the newly desegregated Army. He rose through the ranks. He served. He watched the world change, slowly, in the direction he had spent his life trying to push it. The men of the Triple Nickles went on to be fathers, grandfathers, business owners, educators, community leaders, athletes, artists. They took what they had built in the 555th, that culture of excellence, that refusal to be diminished, and they carried it into everything they did for the rest of their lives. And the Army, the same Army that had refused to send them to combat, that had given them a classified mission designed to keep them excellent and invisible simultaneously, the Army eventually acknowledged what they already knew. The 555th Parachute Infantry Battalion changed everything, not because they were given the chance to change everything, because they insisted on changing it with their bodies and their discipline and their parachutes and their fire tools in a burning Oregon wilderness in the summer of a war that was ending without them. There is a patch worn by the men of the Triple Nickles. It shows a buffalo, the image associated with the buffalo soldiers of the Indian Wars, of the black cavalry regiments that were predecessors of a lineage of black military excellence going back through American history. The buffalo stands within a parachute, and the parachute is supported by 3 nickels, 5-cent coins, 3 of them, giving the battalion its name, the Triple Nickles, 3 coins, the kind of money you find in your pocket, nothing valuable, taken individually. But these men took what the Army thought was small change, a token unit, a test platoon, a classified assignment designed to keep them out of history, and they made it into something that history cannot ignore. If you know their story now, you are part of that legacy. If you tell their story to your children, your friends, the people in your life who have never heard the name 555, the Parachute Infantry Battalion, you are doing the work of historical justice that they could not fully do themselves. The debt to these men is real. Paying it begins with knowing who they were. If this story moved you, and I hope to God it did, do one thing right now. Share this video. Share it with someone who you think has never heard this story, because I promise you, most people haven't. The 555th Parachute Infantry Battalion deserves every audience we can give them. Drop a comment below and tell me, what surprised you most about this story? What's the part that hit you hardest? I read every comment. I want to know what this history means to you, wherever you are in the world. And again, if you haven't already, subscribe to this channel. Hit the notification bell. Because we are committed to telling exactly these kinds of stories, the stories that got buried, the stories that got suppressed, the stories of people who did extraordinary things in impossible circumstances and were told by history to sit down and be quiet. We're not sitting down, and we're not being quiet. New videos every week. We'll see you in the next one. The Triple Nickles, America's first black paratroopers. Remember their name.